Welcome to the next series of in the Rights of Prophets webinars. We have with us Dr. Anant Bhan, who's a physician with a master's in health sciences in bioethics from the University of Toronto in Canada. He works as a researcher and trainer in the field of public health, global health, and bioethics. He has published in both national and international journals and is the associate editor for the Public Health Ethics and Oxford University publication. He is adjunct faculty with the Department of Forensic Medicine at Kasturba Medical College, Manipal. He has also worked at the International AIDS Vaccine Alliance. So over to you, Dr. Bhan. He'll talk about the COVID vaccine and the challenges around it in India.
Thank you so much, Anjali, for that introduction. So I, first of all, thank you for having me and look forward to the discussion. I think the plan, as we had discussed earlier, was for me to maybe do a short presentation just to prime the topic. And then we can have a Q&A, which can focus on some of the other issues which are associated with it. So what I thought I would do is maybe cover some issues which are relevant to COVID-19 from a larger health systems perspective, and then focus down on the vaccines question, because that is what we're trying to discuss today. But I think the larger landscape is also important when we go into the discussion around vaccines. And once we are done with that, then maybe we can have a discussion with everyone who's present, and I'm sure there's a lot to learn based on the experiences that you've had. Just to flag that the presentation will be in English, but I'm happy to answer questions in Hindi. अगर कोई साथी ऐसे हैं जो सवाल हिंदी में पूछना चाहेंगे इस प्रेजेंटेशन के बाद में, तो बिल्कुल पूछ सकते हैं, और मैं कोशिश करूंगा कि उनका जवाब हिंदी में ही दूं ताकि ज्यादा लोग समझ पाएं. So I'll just share my screen now, and hopefully you should be able to see my presentation. All right, so as the topic for today is COVID-19 vaccines and ethics, we will look at the access issues as well as part of that. Now, many of you today morning might have seen this article in the Times of India, for those of you who subscribe to the Times, talking about the COVID-19 vaccine issue and how long do you need to wait before you get a vaccine. And I think this is something which a lot of people are asking, and a lot of people are very curious around what's happening in the vaccine landscape. And obviously that's a relevant question, and we'll go into some detail into this. But what has also happened as of yesterday was this letter which was sent out by our drugs regulator, the Drug Controller General of India, to one of the companies which is involved, the Serum Institute, asking why they had not decided to halt their clinical trials for the vaccine candidate that they're working on, in this case with Oxford University, because there's been a case of unexpected adverse event, a case of transverse myelitis, which has happened in the UK. And so AstraZeneca, which is the partner company, has decided to halt all of their studies for now till the Data Safety Monitoring Board looks at that event and then makes a recommendation whether that is something to worry about or not. But for some reason, the Indian partner said that that's not something which is applicable to us, and we will go ahead with our clinical trials. And so this letter went through. So again, this is something which is relevant also because it relates to safety, and how safety is being perceived, how it's being regulated, and why it's important to be keeping track of all of these issues as they're happening. Now, I want to start off by maybe just looking at some numbers, and I know all of us are now probably tired of looking at these numbers, given that it's been more than 6-7 months that this pandemic has been around, and we are these are front page news articles that you see every day, but the numbers are still obviously very worrisome. The numbers globally are around 2,75,000. So sorry, 2,75 lakhs cases approximately, and almost 9 lakh deaths. If you look at India specifically, we have around 9,20,000 active cases, around 35 lakh cases which have been discharged, which means that hopefully they have gone through the infection spectrum and are now non-infectious. But worrisome also is the fact that we've had at least 75,000 deaths already. And the numbers will vary depending on where you source them from. So the numbers on the top are from the ministry, and there are other trackers which are available, which are being run by civil society organizations or volunteers. So at the bottom, you have the COVID India tracker, which will have numbers which are slightly higher. Now, these other trackers usually try to get information on a quicker basis, sometimes from states as well. And so the numbers are usually on the higher side. Another fact sort of is that these kinds of pandemics, and we're going through COVID-19, tend to reveal some fundamental facts to us. We know that there are issues around deficient health systems. We know that it reveals to us that there is an infrastructure challenge. So the infrastructure challenge for us is a shortage of hospitals, health centers, facilities. Some of that has been addressed, but then what has not been clearly addressed is the fact that there is a shortage of human resources. So you can set up hospitals, you can set up health facilities, but where do you get the doctors, nurses, paramedical staff to run them? A lot of times governments across India over the last few months have set up these mega facilities, converted stadia, etc., into hospitals, but then it's going to be difficult to be able to run them. And that is also a case of systemic neglect and underfunding of the health system for many, many years. The other thing which is relevant here is the issue of gaps in regulatory system. So we have a Drugs and Cosmetics Act. We have some rules which are applicable to any drug, device, vaccine, etc. intervention which is being tested for large-scale implementation from a research perspective. But yet there might not be enough legal provisions which allow for anything to be done which might be more expedited in nature. And there's almost this tension around, as you have seen in many cases, governments and regulators and sometimes researchers wanting to do things faster, but then maybe there not being enough allowance for that in the rules and acts that we have. And what does that mean for safety from a safety perspective? It's also true that many people have written about the fact that we were caught unprepared in many ways when this pandemic arrived, and it's been hitting at our health system now for many months. And it just is showing that unprepared, unresilient health system is always going to struggle. And we've seen that struggle happen both in cities, so Delhi and Mumbai, for example, which have struggled for many months now in terms of being able to respond to COVID-19, but also worryingly rural India. Rural India was always under-resourced as compared to urban India in terms of our health infrastructure. And as the infection is now spreading from urban India to rural India, it's going to be another area where there will be a cause for worry. And we are also seeing the impact of COVID-19 now on many global health indicators, anywhere from tuberculosis to malaria. So there are estimates of almost 1.5 million additional deaths of TB due to the pandemic. Almost 382,000 additional malaria deaths. But given that we are talking about vaccines, it's also true that we need to worry about the impact on existing vaccination programs, which are through the routine immunization, which happens in health systems. So the EPI or the UIP vaccines, even there globally, we have to worry because almost 80 million kids might be at the risk of vaccine preventable diseases because they might not be getting their vaccines on time. They might have missed their doses, etc. So it's not just a matter of looking forward to the vaccines for COVID-19, but even the established vaccination programs, how they are struggling to be slowly restarted in many places, and the impact it might have on child health is something we need to talk about. Now, this is something which has been highlighted, so the British Medical Journal in the end of April had this story around the collateral damage on the health system due to steps like lockdown, the fact that there was a shortage of availability of care. There were not enough fully functional hospitals available. There was an impact on accessibility of care. So transport became a major issue as public transport was shut down. And the only transport which was often available was very, very expensive because you had to hire ambulances which were overcharging. The fact that elective surgical procedures, other elective procedures were being postponed. Vaccination was flagged as a major issue again, that routine immunization activities were still impacted, which these are typically outreach activities. For example, ASHAs, ANMs going out and encouraging vaccination in communities, while institutional immunization had began to pick up, and that has been still the trend. There are many parts of India where routine immunization is still not back on track, and that, as I said earlier, is also going to impact our child health and vaccine preventable disease landscape. So again, this is data which is now becoming more and more apparent that the curtailed immunization schedules, the restricted treatment available, reduced lab investigations, and lowered access to mental health treatment all have had a negative impact on public health, on non-COVID-19 care. It's not the topic today, but today, 10th September, is also World Suicide Prevention Day. And the number of mental health issues related to anxiety, depression, stress, the number of suicides which have been reported is something to worry about as well in terms of impact of the pandemic. Now, the data which has been collected also from rural India is pretty worrying as well. So this is data which comes from Gaon Connection, which is a rural media outlet. They collected this data through a national survey with CSDS, and they found that in their sample across 23 states, almost 42% of pregnant women did not go in for any prenatal checkups as well as prenatal vaccinations. Around 40% of households with pregnant women in green zone districts, so relatively districts which didn't have many cases or very few cases, also did not undergo any pre-delivery checkups and vaccinations. So not just in areas which were hotspots, it was even in areas which had relatively lesser number of cases. And similarly, only 55% of rural households which had kids in them reported vaccination of children happening in the lockdown. So almost 45% maybe not having access to vaccination, and that is something to worry. I mean, again, we don't have 100% vaccination, but the numbers are still much lower than ideal in any case. And piled on top of that is this whole issue of frontline health workers feeling that they are not being recognized for all the outreach work that they are doing with the risks that they are taking, and their demands for fair wages, etc., have not been adequately addressed. So unfortunately, we actually had a situation where there was a FIR filed against some ASHA workers who were just demanding their due rights. So rather than celebrating them, which we have done sometimes with events, the harsh truth is that maybe we are not valuing our health workers enough as well. Now, coming to research, because that is linked to what we are doing in the vaccine landscape, the number of studies which have been happening on COVID-19, and these are studies which have been registered with the Clinical Trials Registry of India, is fairly large. I mean, the numbers have been increasing over the past few months. I've been tracking this for a while. If you just use the keyword COVID-19 as a search word in the registry, that you will find as of today around 490 clinical studies which have been registered. And this is important because it tells us what is the kind of research which is happening in this domain. But if you look at the details, some of the things which can worry you are that a lot of these studies are actually poor quality studies, which is to say that they might not be gold standard randomized control trials. A lot of them might be open label studies, non-blinded studies. They might be non-interventional, or if they're interventional, again, they are not really randomized control trials. So the data that you get from them might be useful in some settings, but might not give you definitive evidence. And so the importance of having good quality research studies, and not just studies, it's not just quantity, but the quality becomes relevant. And an example of that is studies on convalescent plasma usage. As you've seen, there's been a lot of hype on plasma banks and the use of plasma therapy, but not reinforcing the fact that it's experimental and that there is not much global evidence which supports its efficacy or its utility in clinical care for COVID-19. And recent data which has emerged from ICM are still to be peer-reviewed and formally published in a journal, but available as a preprint, seems to indicate that it's not much useful. If that is true, then all the hype we've seen over the last few months have been largely futile, and the amount of efforts which have gone in from families of COVID-19 patients, from governments, etc., might also have not been in the right direction. The other things which we would worry about is the kind of number of samples and data which is being collected in the name of COVID-19 research. And is this being done with proper ethics safeguards or not, is something we should be asking as activists, as folks who worry about health systems. Because in the name of the pandemic, is there adequate care being taken about following proper safeguards or not, is something which is to worry about again. So the samples which are being stored, is there adequate consent taken? What is the rationale for storing these samples for long-term usage, etc.? and the fact that at some point of time there was a shortage of personal protective equipment. So diversion of PPE for research staff who would go and just collect their samples and then go out, discard their PPE, versus those who were offering frontline clinical care is something which could have been a good question to ask, and clearly has not been deliberated enough upon, and also the risks involved during the research enterprise. So there have been folks who have argued that just because we have a pandemic doesn't mean that the standards which are required of any good scientific study do not apply. In fact, they need to be reinforced. So, the fact that any study which happens even during COVID-19 needs to have some degree of importance, needs to be rigorously designed, needs to have analytical integrity, and that the trials involved should be reported completely, promptly, and consistently with the pre-specified analysis which has been written up in your protocol becomes important. And importantly, they should also be feasible. So you don't do studies which are not possible to do, only those studies which are practical. And again, the fact that you can do a lot of research, but what would be good research? What would be policy relevant research? What would be research which could help us move forward in terms of finding a cure or in terms of better understanding of what works in our domain would be probably good quality studies like randomized control trials, because they are probably the most reliable way to identify the relative benefits and risks of investigation products. And again, is that happening enough is something we should be looking into. Now, coming to the issue of vaccines and vaccine research, which is the topic of today's discussion, if you looked at data from the New York Times, the New York Times is running this vaccine tracker for COVID-19. So this is data around July. It shows that there were almost 135 vaccine candidates in preclinical studies, and many more in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. As of this morning, they have removed the preclinical part, but still there's a fair number of vaccine candidates in the fray. So these are vaccines which might be in phase 1 studies, phase 2, phase 3, or phase 4. As of now, around 38 vaccines which are globally being tested on in clinical trials on humans, and around 92 which are in the preclinical stage. Now, there's a whole bunch of vaccines, as we talked about, which are trying to, in essence, create a antibody response, right? Because that's what most vaccines are trying to target, that if you initiate an antibody response and that antibody response is protective against infection, then someone who's immunized could have a much lower possibility of getting the infection, because the protective antibodies produced due to administering the vaccine would protect them. Now, if you look at the vaccine testing process, as we know, there are multiple stages. The preclinical testing stage is when you do testing on animal models, primarily mice, monkeys, etc., to produce an immune response and see if there is promise in taking the vaccine candidate forward. The next one would be, once you have that data and it's promising, then you go to phase 1 studies, which are conducted on human beings. But these are essentially safety studies where the vaccine candidate is given to a very small number of people to test whether this is a vaccine which is safe to give in human beings, what is the right dosage which we can give, what is the dose range which is acceptable, etc. Then you have these phase 2 expanded trials where the same vaccine, once it's cleared phase 1, is given to hundreds of people, which are split into groups. And in the case of COVID-19, because this is going to be a vaccine which has to be given not just to children, but also to other age groups, you would do it across different age groups and then see if the vaccine acts differently on them. And also, does it lead to any kind of an immune response, which might have some protective efficacy. But the real answer around efficacy, whether a vaccine works or not, is typically only given by phase 3 studies, which are where you would give a vaccine candidate to thousands of people, and then see how many get infected across your two arms. Say there is the intervention arm, which is getting the active vaccine, and the control arm, which is getting a placebo vaccine. Then you would compare and see whether the interventional vaccine actually has some kind of a protective effect. And there have been various estimates of what that minimum efficacy needs to be. And in June, the US FDA said that the vaccine would need to at least have around 50% efficacy for it to be considered effective. So we have to also figure out what's the right threshold of to make that decision. Now, in some countries, they've decided to skip certain phases, and that is worrisome. Examples are China and Russia, as many of you would have heard, because I think the regulatory approval following due process becomes extremely important. You don't want to approve a vaccine which could have safety issues later. You don't want to approve a vaccine which might not have enough data to signal to us that there is efficacy, that it works in preventing infection. Some companies or some researchers are also trying to combine phases. So you would have heard of sometimes phase 1/phase 2 trials happening at the same time. And there are some examples of that in India also, which are happening. Now, there are multiple vaccines in development. Some of these are genetic vaccines, some of these are whole virus vaccines, some of these are inactivated or live attenuated vaccines. So again, it depends on how you try to create an antibody response. Do you use the RNA at the core? Do you use a whole virus which is inactivated, or you do something else with the virus? So I guess the scientists among you might be interested in this, but again, different approaches being tried out. If you look at the traditional paradigm of how vaccines are developed, it literally takes sometimes decades. Most vaccines have taken somewhere between 10, 20, 30 years to develop. The least amount of time it might have taken probably is a few years. But literally in COVID-19, we are we're going to uncharted territory. We're trying to do a whole lot of this vaccine development within literally months, or maybe a year and a half. So it's new for everyone, including for the more well-established companies, the more experienced regulators, because this kind of accelerated pathway has never been tried before. Interestingly, it might be good for us from an access perspective to then look at the question of, well, if there are vaccines in the fray, where exactly are these going to be produced? And yes, India is going to be probably a major manufacturing hub, or a production hub. But as of now, based on the players who are leading, who are in the fray, it looks likely that there are many other countries also which are going to have significant production capacity. And the US and Europe is probably the leader from that regard. Now, this might change depending on whether there are more agreements between some of these leading vaccine candidate companies, and if they have any kind of agreement with Indian manufacturers which can do large-scale manufacturing. Now, the other aspect of access is pre-purchases. So as you might have also heard, a lot of companies have gone ahead and made already contracts with many pharma companies, many biotech companies, which are going to be producing these vaccines in advance of the vaccines actually having gone through the clinical trial pathway. So this is just based on a promise that this might work. And if it works, then they are already ready to invest literally billions of dollars in these candidates. So the United Kingdom is a good example. They have already pre-ordered doses in enough numbers. So the numbers here are literally 5 doses per citizen in the UK. So that's the extent of over-ordering that they have done, that they have almost 5 doses per citizen available. And similarly, the US also has done almost the same number. EU, Japan, anything above 1 dose per capita indicates that they have done a fair bit of overbuying already. But that should worry us, because that means that there are other countries which might not have access available, or not enough access for a large section of their population. India is not in the list because I don't think we have yet done pre-ordering. I guess that is because we believe that we have our own manufacturing capacity, which is to be able to do production. But yet, this might also put us behind. So it's going to be a good question to ask from an access perspective. The other aspect is, as I did talk about, India is a major manufacturer for vaccines. In fact, we are a major supplier to both UNICEF, WHO, Gavi, etc. Because we have these companies which are able to produce vaccines at lower cost, at mass scale. But the challenge is going to be that we will also have a large section of the population which needs to be vaccinated. And will we have enough vaccines available, even if we have local manufacturing capacity, is something to discuss. A lot of the vaccine trials are happening primarily around in North America, Europe, Asia, and Australia, relatively lesser in South America and Africa. And there are many questions around what are the kind of standard safety considerations which are being followed or not, and are these standardized or not. As I said earlier, in my second slide, the examples of the adverse event with the Oxford University trial indicates to us that this is something we should be tracking, again, from a regulatory and an ethics perspective. that are there standardized case definitions being used, what kind of adverse events are being clocked, and are they being done in the right way or not. The other important issue, which I think also has been flagged, is that there is already a hesitancy to receipt of COVID-19 vaccines, which is happening. So, we do know that pre-COVID also there was a vaccine refusal movement, there was a vaccine hesitancy movement, and some of that is also rubbing onto COVID-19 vaccines. And people are, there is a section of the population which is concerned about who is developing these vaccines, are they effective or not, are they going to harm us or something like that. So that's also something to respond to. There are going to be some outstanding questions around the COVID-19 vaccines. This is a slide courtesy of Professor Shahid Jamil from the India Alliance. And the questions are, if you give someone a vaccine, are those individuals going to develop immunity? And if they develop an immunity, how long will it last? So how long will it protect them against infection? What kind of an immune response are we looking for? Is it an innate response? Is it a cellular response? Is it a mix of that? How do we know if a vaccine is likely to work or not? What are the kind of correlates of protection that we are looking at? And importantly, will that vaccine be safe or not? So all of those are questions that one would worry about. And as the Lancet highlighted in one of its articles, one of the worries is that if we develop a weakly effective vaccine, it might actually end up worsening the pandemic rather than helping us address it, because it could lead to individuals having this false sense of protection, and hence meaning that they would not comply in the same way with control measures like usage of masks, physical distancing, etc., as they would have done otherwise. So that is also something to remember, that let's not treat vaccines as some kind of a panacea, because we don't know if there will be a perfect vaccine and when will that be available in the first place. There are multiple other ethics issues involved, obviously, issues around community and public engagement to ensure that people understand what they are receiving, the need for advocacy and communication around vaccinations. Should we be doing a targeted vaccination program or a generalized vaccination program? How will we actually ensure that we are able to vaccinate a large section of the population? Because as I said earlier, this is not going to be just a vaccine for kids, it's going to be across the age group. What are the cost implications, etc. So these are some of the ethics principles I'm sure that all of you are familiar with. So for any trial, you would need to worry about consent. How is consent taken? Are you ensuring confidentiality? Are you ensuring that there are ways to address rights to biological material, where that data is coming from, how the samples are being used, etc. Issues around ensuring that there is benefits and minimization of risks, both directly during and after the study. What kind of risk can be there? Are there any conflicts of interest which are relevant? And as well as justice. Who are the people who are participating in these studies? Are we able to protect those who are most vulnerable? Are there issues around stigma and discrimination? Is there a possibility of coercion? As you might have heard, in some countries they've gone ahead and vaccinated soldiers or police personnel. So do those individuals actually have a right to say no? If the government tells them to take a trial vaccine, is it possible for someone in that kind of a situation to say no? And what kind of equitable distribution mechanisms do we have or not? And additionally, I think during pandemics, you would also worry about fidelity. So are you able to establish trust in the vaccine, in the public health enterprise, the importance of veracity, which is telling the truth. So being transparent and accountable to the steps that you're taking. And is that something that we have taken steps towards? Another associated element, I think, is this whole issue of, if you do get a vaccine finally, who are you going to give it to first? If you have limited number of doses, because some other countries have gone ahead and pre-ordered a lot of these vaccines, then how are you going to make decisions around who gets the first set of vaccines? If you have 100 doses available and 1,000 or 10,000 individuals who are eligible, how do you decide? And what kind of principles do we use? And are these transparent in nature, the decision-making criteria? Are they inclusive? So those who might be excluded in the first lot, do they have an opportunity to appeal and say, we should have been in that first list? Or are they just going to be told from a top-down perspective, no, sorry, you're not in the list? Are these decisions going to be consistent? Is there going to be accountability? Is there going to be concerns around favoritism? So those who have political connections, will those be the ones who have first access to the vaccine, etc.? And what kind of criteria will be used? Is it an equality criteria where everyone is equal and everyone has a fair chance, equal chance of getting the vaccine? Is this based on a best outcomes, or is it a utilitarian approach, which means that those who are most likely going to have the best outcomes post vaccination, so someone who might be most healthy, younger, might get a priority? Is it going to be those who are probably going to be the worst offs, those who might be older, those who might be at high risk, those who might be vulnerable with comorbidity? Should we be prioritizing those who are tasked with helping others? So healthcare workers, first responders, civil security, traffic police, etc. Are those the ones who should be prioritized? So again, different criteria might mean that different populations are chosen. And the national academies in the US has just come out like a week ago, I think, with this set of a draft criteria for priority allocation of a vaccine once it becomes available. And there again, it has these similar principles around maximizing benefit to patients, common good, saving the greatest number of lives as possible, allocating scarce resources to help reduce risk, and providing clear and transparent criteria for your priority allocation criteria. Now, some foundational principles that they are using is trying to maximize benefits for the whole population, ensuring that there is equal regard for everyone, that you mitigate any health inequities which already exist. And as you know, in the US, there's now this big debate around racial inequity, the Black Lives Matters movement, etc., which is happening, which is also raising questions because the number of people who are infected and the mortality has been relatively much higher in those who are Afro-American populations or colored populations, and brown populations as compared to white populations, for example. Issues around fairness, evidence-based transparency. Another way of looking at it might be a risk-based criteria. If you have a high risk of acquiring infection, if you have a risk due to of severe morbidity and mortality, would you be prioritized? Risk of negative social impact, risk of transmitting disease to others? Will all of these sets of individuals be prioritized over other individuals? Now, again, there are going to be some factors which will influence vaccine allocation. So the number and timing of when vaccines become available, what kind of a vaccine is it? Is it efficacious? What percentage efficacy does it have? Is it safe? What is the chance of people refusing to take vaccines? What kind of mechanisms for vaccine distribution and administration do we have? And what is the political and regulatory environment which is available? So they have suggested this kind of a phase-wise allocation criteria, where in the jumpstart phase, they're going to recommend that it goes to health workers and first responders. Then anyone who is having a comorbidity. The second phase will be critical risk workers, those who help in keeping the industries which are critical to the economy, which ensure that they are running, teachers and school staff, people in homeless shelters, people in prisons, etc. Phase 3 would be young adults, children, workers in industries, and phase 4 would be anyone else who's left out of this. So that is what they're proposing for the US. Are we doing something similar in India? There seems to be a committee which is looking at it, or a task force which is looking at it in Delhi. But again, this kind of discussion document has not been put in the public domain, so we don't know what criteria they are using. We don't know what principles are being used. We don't know how they're approaching this priority setting exercise. Or is it something which will be just decided by that committee, and that is what we need to follow? Or will there be an opportunity for any public engagement around that decision, and an opportunity for feedback? Will this kind of a discussion note we put out in the public domain is something again to look out for. So I think I will end with the last few slides so that we can have more discussions. What are the kind of ways forward? So we do know that there is a need for more funding. I think that's been apparently clear for many decades now, that we need more GDP percentage investment in healthcare. But it's also important to ask, how are we actually spending? If that increased money comes to us, is it just on infrastructure, building or machines, or also investing in human resources to run this infrastructure? How are we going to ensure that this money is actually disbursed on a timely basis, so that all the money doesn't go only towards November and December, when most of the financial year is already over, and then you only have maybe 1 or 2 or 3 months to spend it? How are you going to build in mechanisms of governance, transparency, accountability, and also ensure that we are building on our strengths for pandemic response, through steps to address our gaps in infectious disease surveillance and disease outbreaks and contact tracing, in having enough staff available from an epidemiology perspective at the district level to be able to gather data quickly and respond. I think it's also important to remember, as we are talking about vaccines, that it's quite likely, even with all the accelerated pathways that we are seeing, that we might not have widespread vaccination. We might have some limited vaccination happening early on, but we might not have widespread vaccination till the middle of next year. So till then, we have to make sure that we have a public understanding that there is a requirement to keep following the basic prevention measures which we know work, and that we should not be looking as vaccines as something which is going to come tomorrow and help us out in any way. This is something which I think has also been reinforced by folks who are involved in global health leadership. So Jeremy Farrar is the head of the Wellcome Trust, and he has highlighted that we need to be knowing that it's quite likely that the first generation of vaccines will not be perfect. So they'll not be 100% efficacious. 100% efficacy has never been obtained in any vaccine, for that matter, and so or maybe except smallpox. But that we need to ensure that we are going to keep track of the fact that these vaccines might only be partially effective. That the fact that there are already many countries which are doing selfish hoarding of supplies by pre-buying doses, and that is something to worry about. And that while urgency is important, it should not mean that we compromise safety, and that is important again from a regulatory and ethics perspective. So there is a need for transparent, rigorous assessment of all new vaccine candidates by independent regulators. Trust is going to be extremely important, and we need to keep building on that. If in the absence of trust, people will not believe any initiatives such as vaccination, and that would be detrimental to public health, and fair access needs to be built in. And again, the fact that others have also highlighted the fact that the public confidence in the vaccine is very, very important. And so we should ensure that there is no political interference in that there is no prioritization of any vaccine and licensure or release into the market or usage in public health programs until you have good quality science and ethics backing it, and we have enough good quality data which indicates that it's useful for large use. We should not let political considerations interfere with those decisions. And this is something I think all of us will agree to, that while we are facing a human tragedy, it's also an opportunity for all of us to ask what kind of a society we wish for after this pandemic is gone, and what are all of us as people who work in community health, in public health, who work in advocacy, who work with civil society, what can we all do collectively and in our own individual capacities to ensure that. So I look forward to responses to that. Thank you so much for listening, and hope this was useful to flag some discussion for today's webinar. Thank you so much.
So thanks for the presentation. Very solid overview of what are some of the issues in the sector overall. साथियों, आपके कुछ सवाल हो तो चैट बॉक्स में डालिए, जरूर से तो इतने में पहला सवाल मैं पूछती हूँ, फिर उसके बाद आप चैट बॉक्स में जरूर डालते रहिए, so that it turns into more of a conversation rather than a one-to-one discussion. So I guess as good a place to start as any is, what are the probable ethical concerns with the current COVID vaccine trials, especially with respect to India, that you might want to, that we need to be aware of?
Sure. So I think I did highlight, the main ethics challenges are going to be around the urgency with the vaccine, as we are seeing that there is a lot of pressure to come up with a vaccine globally, and that applies to India as well. But in that urgency, are we going to forget the minimum requirements from an ethics and regulatory standards perspective? Are we going to hurry through trials without spending adequate time on the minimum safeguards? Are we going to come up with a vaccine which might not be having efficacy, or which might not be safe because we have not spent enough time asking those right questions? Are we doing studies which are probably underpowered, or the sample size is not adequate for us to be able to know whether that vaccine is going to work or not? All of these are questions that you would worry about for any clinical trial, and that applies to India as well. We need to also ensure that the clinical trial participants for these vaccine studies understand that it is research, that they might be in the intervention arm, they might be in the control arm, they might be getting a placebo, they might be getting an active vaccine. There is a possibility there could be an adverse event, there is a possibility there could be risks attached. They need to understand that they are not getting any kind of protection because we don't really know about efficacy, so that they still need to follow the basic public health measures which are advisable. And we need to ensure that there is no pressure on the academics or researchers involved in any way which will influence the data which is being collected, collated, reported on, so to ensure high quality science. So I think all of these are important for any study, and even so probably at this time when we want to ensure that the kind of COVID-19 research which is happening is high quality and with adequate safeguards. Anjela, I think you might be muted. I cannot hear you.
Sorry, how would an unequal access to the vaccine, what impact would you expect it to have on health inequalities in India? And I guess that's an issue that's not just a pan-India thing, it's a global thing. Because you've also touched upon inequalities that are not just about India, but also countries that hold the vaccine also in effect create unequal opportunities between, say, the north and south.
Absolutely. So there will be, so those are the larger questions. There are going to be potential inequities at multiple levels. One is in the global stage. So the richer countries, the global north especially, where they have the resources, many of them have gone ahead and already pre-bought vaccine doses, even while vaccines are still in clinical trial stage. We don't even know if these vaccines work or not, but they've already established agreements, literally of billions of dollars with many companies. So which means that if any of this vaccine candidates actually ends up being successful, already there is going to be an inequity of access. So there is the global platform COVAX, which WHO has talked about, but even COVAX will not have that kind of access to numbers as some of these other agreements might have. And again, some of these countries, maybe 5 or 10, have already bought off so many doses that even COVAX will have limited inventory to work with in the first place. The second issue is within countries. Even for countries where there might be a possibility of getting some vaccines, how are you going to make those decisions? And because not everyone will be able to get access to a vaccine when it becomes available, then what kind of considerations are playing out? Are people who are in urban settings more likely to be prioritized or have a chances of getting access? Is there a possibility that there could be some kind of black marketing? Is there a possibility that criteria might be changed around to suit those with connections, etc.? All of those are things that you would worry about. And those who are most vulnerable, we know for COVID-19, so people with low immunity, people with comorbidity, people who might be older, people who could potentially be at a high risk, are they going to be prioritized in some way or the other? And if yes, what criteria are being used? So I think it's also important for all of us to be equipped with that kind of information, to be asking those questions, so that when those decisions are taken, we can ask the right question of our policymakers. On what criteria did you decide to make these doses available to a certain population? What were the other populations that you thought about, and why did you deprioritize them as compared to someone else? And what is your plan to take this vaccine to scale so that other populations which are not getting the vaccine now are able to get it? Are you going to just stop at the first lot, or how are you building on that in terms of continuity, so that we can provide access to more and more communities, individuals, those impacted? So I think it's important to start planning for that. And hence, we should not be waiting for a vaccine to be available to make those decisions and ask those questions. Those kind of frameworks should be available now and be out in the public domain for feedback.
Because I kind of back to that pre-bought vaccine question. Some of the estimates suggest that some of the global northern countries have probably pre-bought the vaccine for probably a year's worth of supply at current manufacturing capacity.
Yeah.
So therefore, what impact does it have on India? Obviously, we are the ones who might be manufacturing it, and how does one interpret the fact that we have not been pre-buying? Are we uh, how would this work?
Yeah, so it's a bit strange. The Indian government has not gone down that pathway. Maybe they have the confidence that if something is found to be efficacious, it's likely that India will become a production hub for that, and that they might be able to work with the local companies to ensure a prioritized supplies for our own country. Now, how that works might be, I don't know, backstage discussions with the companies involved. Now, some of the companies have also said that they would set aside a large number of doses for India. I think the Serum Institute has gone on record and said that. But again, a lot of time this will also depend on negotiating and what kind of agreements exist. For example, if the manufacturers in India are doing it on basis of licensure agreements with the companies which have produced that vaccine, then what kind of freedom do they have to produce it for local usage beyond that agreement is something which would need to be looked at. I hope there are people in the ministry who are looking at this question and trying to ensure that we have some kind of a secure pipeline. But I don't think we should be looking at it. Part of the challenge with the vaccine landscape right now is that we are seeing an emergence and reinforcement of what is now called vaccine nationalism, which is that every country is worried about their own country and the supply of vaccines for that country. But we have to look at it from a slightly larger global health perspective as well. Just as the pandemic has shown us, we are all interconnected and we are all in many ways susceptible to the spread of infection, and more people who might be protected through vaccines being available from a global perspective will also mean that there is a lesser chance of any further spread of that pandemic strain globally. So I think there is a time also for solidarity and for figuring out which countries need support and working with them to ensure that they also have at least a basic supply of vaccines and not eliminating anyone from the fray.
So we have a question from Vanchika. Since we don't have a really large group, Vanchika, maybe you can ask directly.
Hi, sure. Hi, Anand. Thanks for that wonderful talk. I was wondering the task force that you mentioned is placed in Delhi probably. How is it that we can hold them more accountable in making this public consultation before they go on and have a guideline which has these phases that you talked about in which the vaccine will be dispersed. So I was wondering how as people involved in vaccine ethics, how can people move that body or general bodies like this to do this in a more publicly oriented manner? So your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Vanshika. So I think that's an important question. I think one, we all need to know that there are processes like this which is involved in those decisions, that it needs to be based in the same way you would want for any process, in a way of systematic discussion and using frameworks, in using criteria. So so that any decision which is taken is not subjective because it's just those 5 people who sat at the table that they made a decision based on what their personal preferences might be, but rather that it was put through some kind of a rigorous process. And we need to have that rigorous process publicly shared. It's our right as citizens that if the government is going to take decisions around priority setting for vaccination, that those criteria be publicly available and that evidence be put out there. And we should be demanding that, and we should be asking that whatever decision you take and should be a draft one, and that it should be open to public scrutiny. And I think ensuring that there is advocacy towards that, ensuring that there is pressure, can help make that happen. We've seen that with the National Digital Health Blueprint. The blueprint was put out there with literally only 7 days for feedback, and there was a lot of pushback. And so they've gone ahead and now made that feedback period almost to a month. So the public pressure does work, but that also requires those of us who have access to this kind of information to use that to ask those questions, and use allies in the media, use allies in academia, and work with them to ensure that this kind of decision making is made publicly accessible and accountable.
So are any advocacy groups like this that exist in the current forum that maybe you can write to, or you can talk with, that are doing this kind of work? Anything in your know?
Well, a lot of us in our independent capacity are certainly doing it, but I guess patient groups, campaigns like Jan Swasthya Abhiyan, Oxfam, I'm sure is also looking at some of these access issues. As I said, I guess many of us have been very worried on the immediate response so far, and not so much looking into the future at a vaccine availability scenario and a priority setting scenario. But it's also important to start looking at that. We should not, as I was saying earlier, wait for a vaccine to be available to make those questions, ask those questions, or look at those frameworks. The time is to do that is now, because in advance of that scenario is when we should be prepared, and that kind of a decision making should be made available. Just in the same way any guideline development is done, it should be following due process, involving public engagement, involving evidence gathering, having a clear mandate. All of that should be out in the public domain. A lot of what we've seen in COVID-19 has involved decisions which are sometimes put out, but without any rationale behind them, without evidence behind them being clearly talked about, and sometimes maybe in closed door meetings which you don't have access to, and sometimes you even don't know who was involved in those decisions. So I think we certainly should be expecting more transparency in all of that.
Definitely. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So one of the asks that were there around the earlier in the year around the WHO, the World Health Assembly, has been around in some ways taking off from the issue that Vanshika raised. There has been the demand for a people's vaccine, the mandated worldwide pooling of patents, and the rapid establishment of an equitable global manufacturing and distribution plan, which we've in some ways touched upon. But then there's also the question of guaranteeing that COVID-19 vaccines and treatments and tests and everything else is provided free of charge to everyone, sure, with prioritization, as you mentioned, but also making sure that it is free for those who need it at least. So therefore, uh, what are the possibilities of making the vaccine free, and or at least free for India's poor, and I guess for everyone in that sense, uh, and also making it available for all, because even at the rates of some of the India Serum Institute, given the size of the population, it's still a lot of money.
It certainly is. I think
what should the government do about it, in other words?
Well, the government has a certainly important role to play. Most vaccine research which is happening, including for COVID-19, involves a lot of public sector investment. Often they happen through funding from public research institutions, public research agencies, involve research in academic institutions which are in the public sector, involve a lot of support from the public sector, a lot of hand-holding from the public sector. In many cases, companies are also being supported financially or being given discounts of some kind to enable them to do this kind of research, right? So there is already money being put in directly or indirectly towards the vaccine from the public sector across the world, and that applies to India as well. So if that is the case, and we know that we're dealing with the pandemic and these are extraordinary circumstances, there needs to be some way of ensuring that at the end of the day, those who need it the most are not going to be excluded because of a cost perspective. And that accountability will need to lie at the national level with governments, right? That they have to ensure that is not going to be a criteria. It's not going to be on a cost per dose basis, especially for those who cannot access the vaccine. And the only way this vaccine will actually be useful from a public health perspective is if it reaches enough number of people. If you only end up reaching 10-15%, then the vaccine is hardly going to make a dent. then you might as well continue with our measures now. Those are probably going to be much more effective than a vaccine. Unless the vaccine reaches a certain minimum percentage of the population, it's not really going to make a major impact, and that defeats the whole purpose of going ahead with the vaccination program. But the only way that will work is when there is support from the government available. So that might mean that you have to have special negotiations with companies, the pharma and biotech companies, to ensure cost is kept low, that you might have agreements which are literally running into millions of doses, so that the cost per dose is brought down to a level where it is affordable for the national program. And then you ensure that once you have gotten that, you also make it available to the last mile, to the village, to the community in the periphery which needs it, and ensure that our mechanisms are there for delivery. A lot of our immunization program is very much focused on on a under 5 delivery landscape. So it's primarily targeted at kids and maybe at pregnant women, but we don't have vaccines which are being given to adults in the program. We don't have vaccines which are being given to the elderly in the program, those with comorbidity. So it's also going to be ensuring that we have health systems which are equipped with that capability to deliver vaccines to everyone across the age group, because that's going to be the target for COVID-19. It's not going to be just kids. It's not just going to be elderly. It's going to be literally anyone across the life age spectrum. Anjela, you're again muted.
I'm aware कि मैं हिंदी हम बिल्कुल छोड़ चुके हैं, तो इसलिए साथी जिनको कुछ सवाल हो, तो फिर से जैसे मैंने पहले बोला, ग्रुप छोटा है तो इसलिए आप डायरेक्टली भी पूछ सकते हैं. भारत के साइज को और भारत के आबादी को देखते हुए हाउ डू equitable और स्विफ्ट डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन ऑफ वैक्सीन कैसे हो सकता है जब डेवलपमेंट के बाद, ये होगा कैसे?
अच्छा सवाल है, बिल्कुल इम्पोर्टेंट एरिया है जिसपे हमें सोचने की जरूरत है. देखिए, ऐसा है कि हमारा जो नेशनल इम्यूनाइजेशन प्रोग्राम है वो तो हमारे हर वर्ग को पहुंचता है, और उसके लिए हमारे पास जो डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन चैनल्स हैं वो पहले से ही हैं पब्लिक सेक्टर में. हमें ये भी पता है कि अगर ये वैक्सीन को सक्सेसफुल होना है तो फिर ये हमें पब्लिक सेक्टर से देना ही पड़ेगा. सिर्फ प्राइवेट सेक्टर में रख के या सिर्फ परचेजिंग के लिए रख के अगर हम छोड़ देंगे तो फिर शायद इसका कोई ज्यादा महत्व नहीं रहेगा. अगर इसको हमें हर वर्ग को पहुंचाना है तो फिर हमें गवर्नमेंट का जो डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन मैकेनिज्म है, चाहे वो कोल्ड चेन के साथ हो, चाहे वो आपकी वेयर हाउसिंग होती है, डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन पाथवे होती है, इंश्योर करना होता है आपको कि जो भी वैक्सीन आप गांव तक ले जा रहे हैं कि वो अच्छे से स्टोर्ड रहा है, वो खराब नहीं हुआ है, उसको प्रॉपर तरीके से एडमिनिस्टर किया जा रहा है. अगर ये हम पोलियो में कर चुके हैं और कर रहे हैं, तो हम क्यों नहीं कोरोना वायरस के लिए भी कर पाए. और अगर हमारे पास वो सक्सेस स्टोरीज हैं और वो इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर है जो पोलियो के थ्रू हमने, पोलियो प्रोग्राम की तरह हमने एस्टैब्लिश किया है, तो उसे लेवरेज करने की जरूरत है. साथ में हमें ये भी देखना है कि अगर हम इस टाइप का प्रोग्राम करते हैं तो हम उसको और आगे किस चीज के लिए यूज कर सकते हैं. टीबी हमारे लिए अभी भी एक प्रॉब्लम है, मलेरिया भी प्रॉब्लम है, डेंगू चिकनगुनिया जैसे नए चैलेंजेस आ रहे हैं, जापानीज एनकेफ्लाइटिस है, बहुत सारे नए चैलेंजेस हैं जो बहुत कई सालों से, डेकेड से, ईयर से हमारे साथ रहे हैं, और नए नए इन्फेक्शन भी आते हैं हर साल. तो हमें ये भी देखना है कि अगर हम कोरोना वायरस का जो वैक्सीन मिलता है, अगर मिलता है, और उसके लिए अगर हम एक सप्लाई चेन पाथवे बनाते हैं, तो हम ऐसा पाथवे बनाएं जो किसी भी आगे वैक्सीन अगर हमें मिलता है किसी भी इन्फेक्शन के लिए जिसके बारे में हम बात कर रहे थे, तो उसके लिए भी उसकी यूटिलिटी हो, उसका यूज किया जा सके. ताकि हम एक वर्टिकल प्रोग्राम नहीं सेटअप कर रहे हैं कि सिर्फ भाई कोरोना वायरस के लिए, वैक्सीनेशन के लिए हमने ये सेटअप किया और फिर उसको डिसमेंटल कर देंगे जब कोविड-19 होपफुली एक इशू नहीं रहेगा. बल्कि हम हेल्थ सिस्टम को स्ट्रेंथन करें इस तरीके से ताकि हमारा सिक्योर सप्लाई पाथवे रहेगा, और आगे कोई भी वैक्सीन अच्छा आता है जो कि हमें पॉपुलेशन को देना है तो उसके लिए यूज किया जा सकता है.
अक्षय, आपका सवाल है.
So I have been reading a lot of material about the delivery of the vaccine, and we also deal with a lot of the public health numbers, and what lot of the numbers are about nurses, who can administer that vaccine. So what do you think, if we get that right vaccine candidate at all, what should be the mode of delivery, considering the nurses are very few?
Yeah, so the route of administration certainly is going to be an important part of that plan. If it is something like a oral vaccine, like the oral polio vaccine, then literally any volunteer can do it, and that is the advantage with the oral polio vaccine. Anything which needs to be administered intramuscularly, intradermal, requires usually a trained health worker to administer the vaccine. So that is going to be true also of the COVID-19 vaccine, that it will depend on the route of administration. My understanding is probably likely that most vaccines right now are intramuscular, the ones which are in development. Though some of them are also thinking of trying out intradermal. The advantage with the intradermal is that you might be able to maximize more number of doses as compared to intramuscular. So literally you need to give a lesser amount of the vaccine, and you could still get this a similar immune response. So with the same one dose, you could literally vaccinate more number of individuals. But all of that requires you to do it properly and know how to do it, and requires some element of training. So if we don't have enough vaccine administrators, whether those be nurses, doctors, paramedical staff, ASHAs, the community health officers who are being recruited to run the health and wellness centers, then yeah, that is going to be a challenge, because unless you have trained people who can administer the vaccine, who can ensure that it is safely being given, who can also check and make sure that the vaccine is still viable, then you will have that as a major constraint in terms of being able to provide it to enough people. So maybe that will require some element of training and retraining staff in a way that they are able to provide that vaccine. But it will also depend on finally what kind of route of administration is considered acceptable, and if there is regulatory clearance for. If it is anything which can be given by a volunteer, then it will make it likely that we can reach more number of people faster. But anything which is more technical in nature will probably require us to work with the constraints of human resources that we have.
संतोष, आपका सवाल है या तो दो तीन सवाल एक साथ ले लेते हैं, संतोष, फिर डॉक्टर साई, फिर अग्रिमा।
बेसिकली मेरा जो क्वेश्चन जो है वो वैक्सीन जो डेवलपमेंट का अगर देखेंगे WHO का, तो इंडिया का नाम ही नहीं है। वो कुछ कैंडिडेट्स जो इंडिया में अभी हम सुन रहे हैं, लेकिन WHO का वेबसाइट में वो नहीं है। तो एक सस्पेक्ट क्रिएट होता है मन में कि हाउ इज द देसी वैक्सीन इज डूइंग इन इंडिया, ये कैसे चल रहा है, मतलब ये सक्सेसफुल है कि नहीं, वही क्वेश्चन आप थोड़ा एड्रेस करेंगे तो अच्छा।
डॉक्टर साई। So the question was, thanks Anant, how is it ethical to buy something even before it is made? Doesn't that set inequality right at the beginning? Agrima?
So my question was कि कोवैक्स काफी WHO पुश कर रहा है कि इंडिया कोवैक्स के लिए साइन अप कर ले, बिकॉज इंडिया इज अ बिग पॉपुलेशन कंट्री। तो इतनी ज्यादा वैक्सीन अगर सब्सक्राइब करेगा थ्रू कोवैक्स, तो बाकी कंट्रीज के लिए भी वैक्सीन का प्राइस थोड़ा सा कम हो जाएगा। So do you think India should be subscribing to the COVAX, and what would be the advantages for that for India?
Sure. So I think COVAX is certainly something to look at, because you are leveraging numbers there. No, if the more number of countries which sign on, the larger buying cartel of a kind that you're creating. And at the end of the day, the larger number of supply numbers that you create, the better pricing you can do, and you can do more negotiations with companies involved. That having been said, who sets the agenda within COVAX? What are the criteria? Is it a matter, within WHO also, or within the UN system also, sometimes there have been concerns about those who pay more to the UN having sometimes more ability to negotiate, decisions to their benefit, right? So is it an equitable basis where any country, irrespective of size, population, etc., has an equal say, or are there criteria based on how much you can contribute? What are the who gets to make decisions within COVAX? What kind of criteria are they going to use to decide which country will get access to how many doses? Is it based on population? Is it based on how much they agree to contribute to COVAX as upfront money or as money towards that global purchasing, etc.? All of those would be good questions to ask, but in principle, probably it will be a better model than a model which many other countries are using, which is direct negotiations. So, as was being asked earlier, is that ethical that there are countries which are pre-ordering doses even before trials have finished? Again, I know it's almost like a business decision. That's how it's like how the stock market works. It's like how our oil supply chain right now is globally. It's how the palm oil is bought in advance. It's how gold is. The whole futures commodity market essentially works like that. So that is the global business financial model we have used, and that's what companies understand and follow. So I mean, that's a larger question of the kind of world that we live in. At the end of the day, if companies are run as businesses with financial interests, they are willing to make these decisions. Is that ethical? Is that in public health, global health interest? Maybe not, but it's clearly, for them, the interest of their stakeholders are probably important enough that they're willing to go ahead with this. It also gives them some degree of probably, financial stability to make decisions around setting up supply chains, setting up production lines, etc. So maybe there are other factors which the companies look at, but from equity perspective, it certainly makes it very worrying. For example, as we were discussing, UK has pre-bought doses already for in much higher numbers than would be required for their own population. Maybe they're just diversifying their supply chain, so they've probably bought off multiple manufacturers so that wherever it clicks, they have access to the vaccine. But what does that mean for other countries which might not have that kind of money available to make those decisions? So that is certainly something to worry about. The question around India and why doesn't it probably figure in the WHO depiction? I mean, it would depend on what exactly they are looking at. Is it the leading vaccine candidates? Is it vaccine candidates more based on where the country of origin of the manufacturer or the sponsor is? India certainly has 4 or 5 vaccines which are in the fray. They are not probably right now on the leaders table because they're more at an earlier stage. But certainly India is trying. Historically we haven't been very strong on R&D. We've been more strong on the manufacturing side, but I think we've been picking up pace slowly. So rotavirus was a good example where a lot of the R&D happened in India, and now we have a vaccine which was developed in India and largely created in India, which is being used in the immunization program. With COVID-19, I think we have a few vaccines in the fray. Whether those are good enough vaccines, whether those will be useful, efficacious, is an empirical question. What all of us should be expecting is just like we would want solid data for any vaccine which is produced in a foreign country, whether that be a Chinese vaccine, a Russian vaccine, an American or a British vaccine. We should ask the same questions of Indian vaccines. Just because it's a vaccine produced by an Indian company or through Indian research, the basic concerns around efficacy, safety, and ethical conduct of the trials should not go away. We should hold our own science to high standard as well, so that whichever vaccine comes through and shows some degree of efficacy, we can with confidence hopefully ensure that it is then distributed. If we don't ensure that, then we might end up with the possibility that you could potentially from a low risk perspective maybe have a vaccine which doesn't work, but from worryingly a high risk perspective have a vaccine which is given to a large number of people and ends up causing more harm than good. So I mean, all of that is why we need to ensure that studies are done properly and with adequate safeguards, and that we don't let any shortcuts to be used for whatever reasons, political or otherwise.
किसी और के कुछ सवाल हों?
Can I pitch one more?
Go ahead.
There is a lot of pressure from the media and the political fraternity towards the earliest R&D for the vaccination, which has led to the Astra CEO saying that the vaccine, whatever may happen, the vaccine would be available by the end of this year. How can the R&D fraternity can actually cope up with these kind of stresses and pressures? So if you are actually compromising on your trials and all, you might be ending up with another disaster like thalidomide and kind of things. So how do you think that to cope up with these kind of pressures, and how to raise an awareness that vaccine is not something that could be made in a day or two? I mean, how can make people more acceptable that there is a proper procedure that needs to be followed, and it is very necessary to follow that process for the safety of your own people?
Yeah, it's a good question, Agrima. So I think part of that is an understanding of why ensuring that trials are done properly and with due safeguards, so that all of us are in the know of the importance of doing that. There have been enough examples of trials going wrong because adequate safeguards were not followed. There are enough examples also in the vaccine landscape of perhaps not enough attention being paid to certain elements of the study, certain age groups, which are going to be target age groups, and then ending up with the problem later on. So ensuring that proper safeguards are taken, studies are done ethically with adequate time as required. So even if you compress the timelines, the basic minimum steps that you require of any trial should be followed becomes important. And that's something that all of us as stakeholders in public health in India should be ensuring by asking the right questions. So if you see anything which seemingly is out of place, then we should be asking those questions of the government, of the regulator, of the sponsor, of the researchers, and using platforms such as social media, etc., to raise those questions. And we've seen that being useful. In the past also, I know over the last few months there have been occasions where it seemed like political pressures might have played a role in many countries, and there has been a pushback from scientists, from academia, from researchers, saying that we should not be sacrificing these prerequisites of good quality studies for political reasons and for political expediency. That it's very, very important to follow the basic foundational precepts of science, and I think that has led to in many times a pushback, resulting in regulators insisting that proper standards are followed. Interestingly, almost 7 or 8 companies over the last, I think just earlier this month, have also come out with a public statement saying that only those vaccines which go through proper checks and safeguards should be going ahead, and that there should not be political pressure towards that. So imagine it's a situation where companies are having to actually make out that statement. Usually it's the companies which we criticize on those counts, that they have gone ahead with studies which might not be scientifically sound or expedient, etc. But here it's the companies, and maybe it's also a business interest for them, because if they also know that if they end up having a vaccine which is not efficacious and are forced to take it out to market, or something which is not safe, then they could also be facing liability and a public trust perspective. So from a business perspective also, I think they're worried about the fact that they might be liable for a vaccine which is not useful or is harmful, but is being pushed through to market. So I think they're trying to protect their own interest as well. But similarly, all of us need to ensure that we keep piling on that pressure and are keeping a watch out on all of the studies which are happening, ensuring that adequate numbers are being used, that these studies are happening properly, that the data which is being collected is available in the public domain to the extent possible, and that we raise questions around design, around efficiencies, etc., so that no shortcuts are taken, and that we are all contributing to ensuring that good quality science in the vaccine landscape is happening.
So any last thoughts, suggestions, or comments?
Is that addressed to me or to the audience?
To the audience. but I am assuming there aren't anyone else. It's a strange situation where we end up having the big pharma cautioning against bad against in some ways the possibilities of their own products. Any last thoughts from your side? Anything that we should be aware of, and as a campaign and an organization working on issues of, say, regulation of the private sector, any suggestions for advocacy going forward?
Yeah, so one of the things, I think is important for all of us, who are on the advocacy side, who are interested in public health and ensuring that we move towards health equity, is that, COVID-19 should be looked upon as an exemplar. COVID-19 is not the story. It's an example of where we want the story to go to. So any of the things that we talked about around equity, around access, around good quality research, around public and community engagement, around ensuring that there is adequate funding, ensuring that each country has the capability to be able to contribute to these discussions, but also to be able to work on public health priority areas of their own, requires us to look at the larger landscape. So we can learn a lot from COVID-19, but the issue does not end with COVID-19, and the issue is not just about COVID-19, but those larger global health inequity questions. And I think if we can use the opportunity of COVID-19 to reinforce larger questions around solidarity, equity, around the need for more investments, around the need for more transparency, around governance and regulation, around ensuring that there is more, patient engagement, community engagement, around ensuring that issues around regulation, profiteering, etc., are raised and addressed at this point of time. Probably it'll be better for us. So, many of these issues go beyond COVID-19. COVID-19 is just making them, very much apparent to everyone. And hopefully, the one thing which has happened is that over the last more than half a year, we've had health taking a center place in public discussions, in media coverage. So the time is now. If we cannot take advantage of it now in terms of pushing health to become a political priority, in terms of social sector investments becoming a political priority, it might not happen again for the near future. So whenever now elections are fought, health should be a political priority for decisions, for promises, and ensuring that those are fulfilled. So if we should be asking those questions of our policymakers, rather than diversionary tactics, these are the kind of questions which are important. Why is it that we have a health system which was not resilient enough to be able to respond to COVID-19, and how can we do better for the future, and what are policymakers going to do for that, and what kind of promises are they making, and how do we ensure that they fulfill them and don't fail us again. So I think a lot of lessons for us, and hopefully a clarion call for our fellow citizens in demanding their health rights.
I guess that probably is the note at which we will probably end this call. If one doesn't make, if education, if health doesn't become a political issue at the end of the on the back of the pandemic, probably nothing else can make it one. Thanks for taking part in this webinar, and see the group again probably in 2 weeks for the next in this series. Thank you.